I'm Avery Hartman, 34. And 6 weeks ago, my mother left me outside a shelter in Portland with one suitcase and a warning disguised as concern when she murmured, "You should think carefully about that house before everything collapses." I walked in numb, carrying her words with me like a bruise I couldn't hide. And the director, Owen Beckett, glanced from my face to the SUV disappearing down the block as he said, "I've seen that license plate before." His voice tightened in a way that made me look up. And he told me the number matched a recent expense logged as a transportation asset for the nonprofit he oversaw, though the registration had somehow ended up under my mother's personal name. In that moment, the cold in my hands didn't come from standing outside. Because Owen's certainty made one thing painfully clear: being abandoned wasn't the only thing she wanted me to lose. My phone rang the next morning. And before I could say hello, my mother's voice slipped in with, "Avery, we need to settle the matter of your grandfather's house." While I stood in the shelter hallway staring at the chipped edge of my suitcase as if it might steady me, she went on about a family trust she claimed would help all of us. And when I asked why my signature was suddenly urgent, she said, "Because that property is wasted in your hands." I told her I wasn't signing anything until I understood the terms. And she answered with a clipped, "You've never understood what this family requires from you." The line clicked. And for a moment, I let the silence press against me harder than her words. Lydia called not even 10 minutes later and asked if I could stop being dramatic for once, insisting the house should be transferred so she and Grant could secure a loan. Because, in her phrasing, "You're not using it. And we actually need it." She talked fast, layering urgency with guilt. And when I asked why my stability should hinge on her financial mistakes, she sighed as if I were the unreasonable one. Grant's voice slid into the background to say, "If she won't cooperate, we're done helping her." As if the help he mentioned had ever existed. I told them both the deed had a clause forbidding any transfer without my full consent. And the way Lydia went quiet told me she'd hoped I never read it. My mother called back that afternoon with a tone so polished it sounded rehearsed, telling me she could guide this process smoothly if I stopped resisting and came home to sign the papers in person. I reminded her she'd left me in front of a shelter less than 24 hours ago. And she replied, "Don't twist the narrative. I gave you a chance to reflect." She said Lydia was under enormous pressure and added, "Sometimes you have to give more than you receive." A lesson she'd only ever applied in one direction. I told her the house stayed with me, and she inhaled sharply before ending the call without a goodbye. I set the phone down and looked at my grandfather's old pen inside my bag, remembering how he'd once placed it in my palm and said a signature meant something only when you chose it freely. The memory hit harder now that everyone seemed determined to rewrite my choices for me. And the shelter's quiet hallway felt like the first place where I could hear my own refusal clearly. I kept replaying their rush of voices, all circling the same demand. And the pattern was impossible to ignore after hearing Grant say he would pull all support if I didn't comply. That single phrase told me the house wasn't a family matter at all, but a lifeline they wanted to cut from my hands. And the weight of that truth settled in as sharply as the cold I carried in from the street. The notice arrived, folded beneath my mother's handwriting. And before I finished reading the line stating I had 24 hours to vacate her property, she called to say, "This is procedural. Avery, don't make it emotional." As if the threat wasn't printed clearly above her signature. I reminded her I had only asked for time to stabilize. But she cut me off with, "You need pressure to act responsibly," and ended the call while I was still holding the page. By the time I stepped outside with my single suitcase, she was already in her SUV telling me, "You'll thank me when you stop resisting," a sentence that landed as sharply as the cold wind moving across the pavement. I watched her drive away and realized the paper in my hand was the only explanation she intended to offer. Owen met me at the entrance with a quiet, "She dropped you here after serving you that notice," and his tone tightened when I nodded because the envelope was still in my grip. I told him the message was clear, even without her voice repeating it. But he asked me to walk him through exactly what she'd said so he could understand the timing of why the SUV had shown up in their financial logs. When I repeated her line about pressure teaching me responsibility, he exhaled and said, "That's the same month she filed a reimbursement for a vehicle that shouldn't be in her name." Hearing that pulled every detail of her departure into sharper focus, like the way she didn't linger long enough to hear a response. He told me their finance coordinator had flagged the expense because the invoice listed a program budget code, while the registration pointed directly to Marion Caldwell. And the mismatch had forced the center to request verification. I felt my stomach shift when he added, "Your arrival today lines up with her attempts to push that paperwork through before questions pile up." And the overlap made it impossible to ignore the way she'd rushed me off her property. I said I didn't know she was managing anything beyond the trust she kept mentioning. And Owen answered carefully, "She's managing more than she wants anyone to notice." His words settled over me with the same clarity I'd felt reading my eviction notice. Removing me wasn't the punishment. It was the leverage she needed. The call from an unfamiliar number came just after sunrise. And when I answered, a woman introduced herself as counsel for the Caldwell Family Trust before informing me, "Ms. Hartman, the board is prepared to offer you $12,000 if you sign over the property at once." While I stood beside the shelter's coffee urn trying to make sense of her certainty, I told her the deed prevented any transfer without my explicit consent. But she replied smoothly, "Provisions like that can be negotiated when all parties act in good faith." As though my eviction notice hadn't been time-stamped the night before. When I repeated that, I would not sign. She warned that disputes of this kind often became stressful for individuals with limited stability. A phrase so pointed it felt lifted straight from my mother's vocabulary. I hung up with my hand still around the warm metal of the urn, realizing the offer had never been a negotiation but a threat wrapped in legal phrasing. By noon, Owen found me in the lounge and asked gently, "Did you receive anything unusual this morning?" After spotting the folded letter still tucked between my fingers. I explained the offer and the timing. And he nodded slowly before telling me the center had just received a formal inquiry from state services containing allegations that I was unable to maintain basic living conditions. A claim clearly crafted to mirror the surroundings I'd been forced into. I said my mother must have filed it. And he answered, "The language matches the complaints we see when someone wants to apply external pressure." A conclusion made unavoidable by the copy of the inquiry bearing today's date. He assured me the shelter's record-keeping would refute every line. But the intent behind it stayed lodged in my chest. Later that afternoon, I received a text from my mother reading, "Cooperation would spare you unnecessary scrutiny." Written with the same distant politeness she used when canceling holiday plans. I asked her why she thought threatening me was the path to resolution. And she responded, "I'm guiding you toward the only option that won't damage you further." As though she hadn't orchestrated the damage she referenced. When I told her the accusation sent to the state was transparent, she replied, "You've made your situation unclear to outsiders." Framing my homelessness as a flaw in my character rather than the result of her choices. I stared at her message until the screen dimmed. Knowing the inquiry's arrival just hours after the trust's offer was all the clarity I needed. Owen asked me to sit with him in the small office off the common room. And as he opened a folder, he said, "If you're willing, we can build a record that stands on its own." While the edges of printed invoices shifted under his hand, he showed me the reimbursement request tied to the SUV and added, "Her signature is here. But the vehicle registry contradicts every line of this." And the mismatch landed with the same weight as the inquiry letter I still kept folded in my pocket. I told him I wanted every document that proved what she'd done. And he nodded, saying 2 board members had quietly asked for clarification on prior spending, but needed concrete evidence before forcing an audit. Hearing that, I realized the pressure she'd aimed at me had been meant to keep those questions from surfacing, not to guide me anywhere. Over the next hour, he printed the internal emails from their finance coordinator. And after scanning the subject lines, I asked why the coordinator hadn't raised the alarm sooner. To which he answered, "She did. But the chain stopped with someone who reports directly to your mother." The explanation matched the stalled timestamps on the messages, each one sent weeks before my eviction notice, and it made the pattern impossible to dismiss. I told him she'd always counted on people backing down when she gave direction. And he replied, "Board members don't back down when policy is broken." A statement grounded in the bylaws he had placed between us. When he passed me the packet, the weight of the pages felt like the first thing in weeks that wasn't uncertain. Later that evening, one of the supporting board members called through Owen's phone and said, "We will initiate the request for an independent audit if the documentation withstands review," speaking carefully as if every word needed to be preserved. I introduced myself and explained the sequence of events leading up to my arrival at the shelter. And the board member listened before saying, "Her public persona complicates this, but the evidence is what matters." Their tone held steady, shaped by the email I had just read aloud from the finance coordinator. When the call ended, I exhaled slowly, knowing they wouldn't have reached out if they didn't already suspect what the records confirmed. Before leaving the office, Owen handed me a fresh printout of the SUV invoice, pointing to the date that preceded both the trust's offer and the complaint filed against me, and said, "This timeline is going to matter more than anything she claims." I told him I understood, and the truth of it settled in as cleanly as the ink on the page because every document aligned with the moment she pushed me out. Walking back toward the dorm hallway, I held the folder close, aware that the evidence didn't just reveal what she'd done, it revealed why she'd needed me gone. The hall in Denver was already filled when I arrived. And before I reached my seat, my mother caught my arm and whispered, "You will not embarrass me tonight." As if the program booklet listing her as an honoree didn't rest in every guest's hand. I told her I had nothing to hide. But she leaned closer and said, "Then sign the transfer papers after my speech. And we can put all this tension behind us." Slipping the envelope against my palm like a secret meant to vanish, I answered that coercion wasn't closure. And she replied, "Avery, you don't understand what's at stake for our family." Her tone cracking for the first time since she'd left me at the shelter. I folded the envelope and kept walking, knowing the board members who invited me here were already waiting near the stage. When the ceremony paused for her award presentation, one of the directors approached me and murmured, "If you're ready, this is the appropriate moment." While guests settled into their seats with the ease of people expecting a polished tribute, I stepped forward as my mother accepted her plaque and told the crowd, "My work is built on accountability." A line that echoed through the room just as the director beside me said, "We'll now open the floor for a brief inquiry into financial stewardship." My mother's smile faltered as she turned toward me and asked quietly, "What are you doing?" before I handed the director the binder of invoices she had signed. I said nothing more then. These documents contradict the reimbursement filings. And the shift in the room felt immediate. She tried to brush it aside by telling the board, "There must be a clerical error. My daughter doesn't understand internal processes." But the director held up the registration form and stated, "This vehicle is titled to your personal name, Miss Caldwell, though it was funded entirely through your outreach program." Hearing that, she glanced toward the audience as if searching for an ally, then turned to me and hissed, "You're letting outsiders manipulate you." I answered that the timestamps spoke for themselves, repeating her own line about accountability from minutes earlier. The director then asked her to clarify why the program budget had been depleted without corresponding service records. And the silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. From a table near the front, Lydia stood abruptly and said, "Mom, tell them you used the funds legally." but her voice trembled the way it used to when she sensed everything slipping. Grant rose beside her and announced, "We're separating. Lydia. And I won't tie myself to financial risks I didn't create." Revealing a truth she clearly hadn't expected. My mother snapped, "Not now." But the director responded, "This pertains to ongoing fiduciary review." And the room held still as he read the final discrepancy aloud. I watched my mother's expression tighten when he concluded with, "Pending verification. Your leadership privileges are suspended, effective immediately." A sentence she'd spent her whole life believing she was untouchable enough never to hear. When the meeting recessed, she cornered me near the aisle and whispered, "You've destroyed everything," gripping my arm just hard enough to betray how shaken she was. I told her she had done that long before I arrived, and her fingers loosened when I added, "All I did was stop carrying the blame for you." As she stepped back, the director approached to say, "Thank you for cooperating with the review." And his formal tone left her no room to argue. I walked out of the hall aware that the evidence had spoken louder than any defense she could offer. And for the first time since she pushed me from her doorstep, I felt the weight lift. Returning to Portland felt different after Denver. And when Owen told me, "Your application for the repair grant was approved," I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding while we stood beside the porch that had once smelled like my grandfather's tobacco. I thanked him and said, "This house finally feels like mine again." Because the scaffolding stacked in the yard matched the work order dated only a week after the symposium. The contractors moved through their checklist with the steady pace of people who had seen worse and knew recovery wasn't always loud. And I listened to the rhythm of hammers as if it were proof that something in my life had started to rebuild. Standing in the doorway at dusk, I realized I no longer braced for my mother's voice to fill the silence. A few days later, my phone buzzed with a message from Lydia that read, "Can we talk when you're ready?" written in the cautious handwriting of someone who understood too late the cost of her alignment. I answered, "Not yet." But I heard what happened in Denver, and left it there because the resonance of that evening still sat between us like a closed file we weren't prepared to open. She replied that she hoped we could find our way back. And I stared at the screen long enough to understand that reconciliation would require more than shared history. Setting the phone aside, I stepped onto the newly repaired porch and let the quiet settle, knowing the space I stood in existed because I had refused to sign it away. Thank you for staying with me through this story, because telling it out loud helped me hear the clarity I'd been missing. If any part of my path echoed something in your own life, I hope you find a place that lets you breathe again. I'm grateful you spent this time with me. I'll see you in the next story.